Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're so excited to have you all here. My name is Stacy Ajum, and I'm the marketing manager here at Siegel Scientific. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This meeting is being recorded. However, you all are on mute, so if you don't feel comfortable, please log off at this time. All attendees and registrants will receive access to the recording via email. And at the end of our session today, we'll have time for a quick Q&A. So please submit your questions. If we don't get to your questions during this session, no worries. We'll get back to you via email as well. All right. So our hosts for today's webinar of Explore Integrations with Bartender are Elizabeth Sinclair, who is our Director of Marketing, and our Enterprise Sales Engineer, Peter Hernandez. A little bit of info about Peter. So he's been with us for 6 years, and he specializes in our enterprise deployments. He's also been with SAP America as a project manager and implementation consultant for 4 years, and he spent 5 years at IBM Global Business Services, specializing in SAP, as well as project management, implementation, and consultation. He's also SAP certified, and he has over 20 years of experience in IT software. So please, everyone, give a warm welcome to Elizabeth and Peter, and let's get started.
Hi, everyone. This is Elizabeth Sinclair, not Peter. I'm excited for our session today, and I'm especially excited to be talking with Peter Hernandez because I learn something new every time I talk with him. There are a couple of things I'd like to add. As Stacy mentioned, we'll get to as many questions as we can today. Any questions we don't have time for, we'll respond to offline. And then in addition to sending you a link to the presentation and webinar recording, we'll be posting the recording to our YouTube channel with transcriptions to several different languages. The transcription process takes time though, so please allow a week or so for the translations to appear alongside the recordings on YouTube. And our channel is Siegel Scientific. So one of the reasons that I'm proud to represent Bartender is because of the really smart people I get to work with. There are thought leaders from top to bottom at Siegel Scientific, people who have driven development and adoption of auto ID technologies in every industry and every application. Peter has been working with us since 2015. And since then, and actually over the course of his whole career, he's facilitated enterprise deployments in the world's largest and most dynamic supply chains and in the most demanding regulatory environments. Not to brag on him too much, but in my estimation, there are very few people in the world with his depth of knowledge and breadth of experience in enterprise labeling deployments, and particularly in integrating business systems with labeling. He's seen it all, and we're lucky to have this chance to talk with him today. So we're going to start out talking about what's happening in the ERP world, maybe define a few concepts, and then Peter's going to go a little more in depth and we're all going to learn something. So, hi, Peter.
Hey, good morning. You are far too kind with your compliments. Thank you.
Well, let's pick your brain a little bit. So what trends are you seeing in enterprise integrations? What are end users looking for?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in order to answer that question, it might be pertinent to kind of go through the arc of, where it all started and where we're at and where things are going. So when enterprises first began integrating their server applications with other server applications, primary method to do so was some form of EDI, basically FTP, SFTP, just transferring data back and forth, file-based. And that required specific skilled resources with specific programming skill sets for both the system of record, the source system, and the system receiving the data, the target system. Since my background is with SAP, I'll give an example of how integrations have changed over my time implementing SAP systems. Now this is just an example. I think the arc is is fairly consistent among those ERPs and large WMS systems and whatnot that have been around for quite some time. But this is just an SAP example. So data exchange followed a couple of paths. One for integrating between SAP systems and modules, so within the SAP ecosystem, and the other for integration with external third-party systems, non-SAP systems. The SAP internal path transmitted proprietary IDOC data containers, and these are basically SAP formatted ANSI files, basically text files, transmitted via, again, proprietary ALE functionality within SAP, application link enabling. So that was within SAP. And then the second path also transmitted IDOC data containers to external non-SAP systems, but via EDI, like I mentioned before. Since IDOCs contain transactional data along with proprietary syntax, semantics, these skilled resources needed to write code for the target system to accept, read, and process the format of those documents. Since many longtime customers of Siegel Scientific still use IDOCs for the purpose of integration, Bartender does have pre-built database integration that will interpret and map the segments of the IDOC message for the purposes of mapping the transactional data to data sources to your label documents. So this path, this was the path for integrations, but users wanted a bit more flexibility and control over their integrations between systems. So SAP moved more towards the use of WSDLs to facilitate integrations between SAP systems and third-party systems. Now, WSDLs stands for Web Service Description Language. So the use of WSDLs was beneficial since it was XML-based, web-based, and most importantly, more open source, not proprietary to one system or another. So with WSDLs, custom code still needs to be written on both the source and target system, since the definition of the two endpoints is specified in the WSDL itself. But nowadays, with system with system-to-system integrations being so prevalent in the enterprise area, customers tend to want the process of integrating their systems to be as scalable as possible. Even the use of WSDLs can be way too complex for many organizations, specifically for those that don't have, skilled resources, those types of skilled resources on hand. They don't want to invest in specialized resources to set up and maintain their integrations for the myriad of systems that they may be interfacing with. They want ease of use and particularly quick time to deployment. So the more open source and standardized an interface can be, the better. Today I'll show how Bartender facilitates these interfaces in such a way that is open source and scalable. So that's what Bartender tries to provide is an open source platform that is scalable as well.
Some companies use custom-built interfaces to ERPs. First, can you explain what these are? And then, in your opinion, what are the advantages and disadvantages in this type of integration?
Yeah, sure. So a custom-built is generally code for time-insensitive and expensive for many. So usually when someone refers to a connector, they're talking about some sort of custom-built transaction in the source system or the target system or both. So like in my SAP example with IDOCs, WSDLs, ALE, EDI, while still being used today and work just fine for the purpose of integration, the drawbacks are that anything custom requires dedicated skill sources and often takes more time to implement and be costly to maintain. So, I mean, Siegel has taken the approach of making it as easy as possible for any system to integrate with Bartender, utilizing service-oriented architecture that is independent from any one vendor or independent of any proprietary technology. And that just makes it easy to implement such that you don't have to build a custom connector, a custom integrator between Oracle, and then a separate one for, say, Microsoft Dynamics, then a separate one for SAP and or whoever, even the legacy ones like JD Edwards, PeopleSoft, those types of things. So in Bartender, you build the integration, you deploy it, and that integration can facilitate communication with multiple different systems, regardless of back-end technology, even homegrown systems.
Okay, so let's get to the meat of this presentation, Peter. Help us understand the advantages of Bartender for business systems integrations.
Okay, so within the Bartender suite of applications, the primary application, the platform really, is Integration Builder. So I'll review the options that you have from an enterprise perspective for integrating with these backend systems. So the integration platform basically consists of two applications that Siegel provides, the Integration Builder application and the Administration Console application. Now, particularly for enterprise level deployments, this is key because, as we know, there is certainly a life cycle for these complex, large, SAP, Oracle, ERP, large deployments, such that there's, test, there's build, test, QA, production. So it has a full life cycle, all of your configuration and development. So Bartender can work with that in that the Integration Builder application is where you go and build and test your integrations independent of what is in the productive state, allowing business continuity. And then the Administration Console is where you would deploy those integrations into, say, a production environment. And you can manage those as well in the Administration Console. So consistent with enterprise-wide deployments in that regard. So one of the first considerations in building your integration files, regardless of the backend system that you're integrating with, is to determine what mechanism you're going to use to integrate. I will say, on the left, you see, where it says file, web service, email, network socket, so on. Those are all the exposed integration methods that Integration Builder provides. So one of the first considerations is to determine what method you want to use. File has been around for quite some time, so that's tried and true method. But I will say, in an enterprise environment, and particularly given what was discussed up front in this meeting, I would say that web service as well as database are probably the two primary methods for enterprise level customers right now. And I'll get into the reasons why for that. But web service is tried and true method, particularly if you're integrating your application server data with multiple target systems, which is likely the case for any large company. Web service is just an open source web-based way of implementing. And then database, of course, Bartender can connect directly to a transactional database, and anytime a backend system transaction is created and that save button is created, so people just do their day-to-day business, unrelated to any type of integration or labeling configuration, a label can spool out or processes related to that label can execute just based on the backend transaction and the fact that the information in those transactions will write to the database. So a database insert record can be a trigger event for the creation and printing of a label. So once you determine what integration method you want to choose, you create the integration file based on that decision. So for a web-based, when you create the Integration Builder file, it will expose an IP address, basically a URL, that source application will connect to and transmit data. So for a web service in particular, that source system will queue the data relevant for the label print job, send it across the web as an HTTP message. In the body of that message will be the transactional data relevant for the label print job, and the integration service will be triggered. So how the integration service would work is once you deploy that integration file, it runs as a system service. So basically at the OS level, at the Microsoft OS level, such that anytime that request is noted, that it's receiving a request, that will be the trigger event for the service to execute, and that in the data in the integration file to process. So it'll read the data from the body of the HTTP message. It'll parse out all the relevant tags to identify where the source data needs to go on the label. Other information such as what label to print or labels. You can definitely print multiple labels in one request, and of course which printers to print to. So that integration service will be triggered. What we call actions will be executed. I mean, the end action, the most basic action would be the print document action. So the request is received, the integration service is triggered, the document prints, particularly for high throughput environments. So manufacturing facilities, you make a widget every 10 seconds, you need to print labels relevant to them. We have an intelligent print scheduler service, which will launch an appropriate number of print engines, basically guaranteeing throughput, guaranteeing integrity of order, particularly useful if you're doing something like serialization. You certainly want your labels to have consistent serial numbers on those labels, and then obviously those labels will print to the appropriate printers. I will mention that as part of the integration ecosystem, there's quite a bit more than just the print document action. At the end of the day, Bartender just needs the data, and once the data is received, it can manipulate that data, transform that data, perform several different actions based on the receipt of those records. So you'll see that on the bottom right. So you can transform event data, like let's say you have internal part numbers and you need customer specific part numbers. Well, you can do that transformation such that the customer specific part numbers are actually populated on your label within the Bartender environment. One example that I like to give quite a bit is the web service bidirectional capability. So let's say your source system has a subset of data that is relevant for those labels, but you need additional information in order for that label to print accurately. So what Bartender can do is it can accept the web service transmission from your source system, which includes a subset of data relevant for those labels. And then it could have a wait transaction, and then it can send an outbound web service to, say, a vendor machine that has additional information. That vendor's machine can then send additional data back to Integration Builder, and then the source data and the vendor data can be combined and populate the label with data that's coming from both systems. So quite a bit of flexibility and functionality around actions within Integration Builder. And things like, specific to like a database integration, you can write back to a database, say updating that a record was printed, or updating it with any type of information that you see fit at print time. So here's a representation of a bidirectional web service. It's basically consistent with the previous slide. It's just it goes through the workflow. So up on the top, you have your backend system. As I mentioned up front, Bartender really doesn't care where the data originates. So that's why you see SAP, Oracle, General ERP, home legacy systems, home in-house built systems, the data can come from pretty much anywhere, particularly since we use this open architecture, web-based architecture, service-oriented. So Bartender will expose a URL, so you see that HTTP message there next to the Bartender production server. The integration service will be listening for the web service request, and it'll set the payload to event data. So this is important in that you want to be able to, from an enterprise perspective, you want to be able to minimize the amount of the number of integrations and the amount of actual work that you have to do to configure these things. But with Bartender using event data, it makes the process very seamless. And I have an example, I'll actually in a bit, that I'll take you into Bartender, and I'll show you how you can easily leverage your backend database structure. So as we know, all backend systems such as SAP, Oracle, they have a very detailed and involved set of tables and fields for multiple purposes. And those unique tables and fields can be leveraged for multiple purposes for label printing. In order to facilitate the ease of use and minimize the number of integrations you create, you can basically download and install all of your label field names such that it just becomes an exercise in dragging and dropping those tables and fields from your backend system to the label itself. And because we're using all data coming from that source system as event data, the mapping will already be done for you. So the transactional data in one field, like SAP, I'll say like KNA1 Kuhner, customer number, that'll automatically map to the appropriate field on the label. So once that data is received, it'll map it to the relevant fields, the data sources on the labels. Once that integration service executes, and then the print scheduler service will assign the print requests. Things like Printer Maestro will capture print information and job verification, and then we can respond back to that original web service message with either a high level of detail, such as yes, everything worked successfully, it's spooled successfully, or a very granular level of detail, that really down to the field level of what transpired during the transmission of that web service request. Because we're talking about system-to-system integration without any user intervention, many companies are requiring those response messages because if they want to ensure that everything is working as designed, and they may want to update their backend systems with specific print relevant information related to that integration. And then last but not least, the license server will keep track of what printers are being printed to. Okay, so when I talked about that event data, Bartender heavily leverages what we call variables in the integration platform. So, at the highest level, when we're talking about event data within the integration, if you have the same name as in your source system that you do on the label itself, you're pretty much done. So part number, if that's what it's called in the source, whether it be Oracle, SAP, wherever, and that part number field is named the same on the label, that part number will be variable in such that anytime a value is placed in that part number field in your backend system, the value within that field will be passed to the appropriate label. So everything is variable such that you don't have to specifically configure every single field that you need to pass data from your source into the target, which would be the Bartender label document. And then I mentioned actions as well. So actions can be fairly robust and they can be assigned through the integrations. So for those existing bartender customers that may not have used Actions much. If you go in the Integration Builder and select Actions under All, you'll see a whole host of actions that you can perform. And these are just activities that bartender itself can do after the data is received. And I gave a couple of examples of writing back to a database, moving files, calling out to external systems, those types of things. So another thing is you can data source many different variables within Actions and use those throughout your integration. So that little screenshot on the bottom where it says printer name, BTW to print. So you can data source your printers, data source the documents, and actually leverage those within your integration such that you can, within one web service transmission, you can say, okay, I want to print this database record or this record, transactional record, to printer 1, and then the next item I want to print to printer 2, and then I want to print the first one to label 1, and I want to print the second one to label 2. So lots of different variables, both global, such as printer and document, as well as very specific pieces of information, such as jurisdiction codes, things specific to that backend system. So web service, like I mentioned, is the primary method of integration for enterprise. More and more customers are using database integration as well, so thought I'd mention that. So database is the only integration method that doesn't require any sort of transmission of data. So as I mentioned, a user of SAP or Oracle, they would do their data job. Let's say they create a shipping transaction, they click save, they're done. They just want the print job to execute and print on a printer next to them or in a data center, wherever it might be. So that whole process can be facilitated in a very seamless manner through a database integration, because that transaction will inevitably write to a database of some sort, whether it be the Oracle database, Microsoft SQL database, Azure SQL, and then bartender can monitor specific fields and tables within the database. And anytime a database insert record is noticed, that would be the trigger event for bartender to execute one of many actions. And like I said, the most basic action would just be the print action. So bartender will monitor the database, sees that there's a database insert, will read the contents of that database record string, parse out that data, pass it to the label or labels that need to be printed, and spool it to the appropriate printer with all of the transactions populating the appropriate data sources. Okay, so not quite time for questions yet, but we'll get there. So I did want to show, I did do a little mock-up just to show you how easy it is from an enterprise perspective to perform a web service integration. So all I did was I created that web service integration file, and I could just do one document, but I just did 2 documents so that you can see that one web service request can facilitate the printing of multiple documents. You don't have to create multiple web service messages for each document. One web service message can facilitate printing one or many labels. So before I open these documents, I will show you, and this is an accelerator that I tell many customers to use in an enterprise environment. So if I go ahead and open up Bartender Designer, just go in and create new one, blank template. So here I have a blank template with no fields and no data sources on it. As we know, for enterprise customers, large Fortune 500 customers, the number of fields relevant for label print jobs can be in the hundreds if not the thousands. I mean, so one thing that I recommend for enterprise levels customers is to go into their backend data dictionary. So again, because I'm more familiar with SAP, I'll give that as an example. So if you go into like a transaction SE11, which is basically the ABAP data dictionary in SAP, you pull up table DD03L. It'll basically show you every single field that exists in the in SAP, really. And then of course you'd want to filter that down to not download every single field, but you could. So what I suggest is you go in to your data dictionary. Oracle has one, SAP has one, everyone has one. Download into a file of some sort a running list of all of your fields that could ever possibly be relevant for label print. And again, that could be hundreds, it could be thousands, who knows. And then once you download it into a file, you can easily import that into Bartender. And then it just becomes an exercise of dragging and dropping, dragging and relating to data sources on your label. So let me just add a couple of text fields here. I'll add a barcode. I'll add a picture file. Well, let me add the picture file in a minute. So how do I get all that information into Bartender? So as I mentioned, you go in, you download all of your fields relevant for label print. You connect that to a database, connect the label to the database. So I did a download of table VBAC in SAP, a subset of it because I didn't want every single field, and just included it in this file. So VBAC is the sales document header table. Then I go ahead and import this. Okay. So what you see here under database fields is a list of SAP fields that reside in table VBAC within the SAP system. So these are now available to me to populate data sources and objects on the label. So then it just becomes an exercise of dragging it onto the data source. Oop, gotta get it right. And then I'll disconnect there. And then I can drag this onto the barcode. You can data source pictures as well. So get a file name from database field. So I say, okay, let's say I want, this is a picture file, so I can do that. So there you go, that's it. So there could be thousands of database fields here available to a label designer where they can easily map those fields. All right, let me go into the labels that I created just to show you. Forgot which here. So I created a couple of documents, did the same thing, just imported that database field, dragged a few, changed the background color, added the picture. So here's a field, TR-VOG, that I'm using as a picture source. And if you go back into the list of fields, you'll see that I'm specifying a file path for that label to pull in the image file. So this is coming from SAP or some other system, the file path, and then Bartender just picking it up and populating the appropriate picture. So for picture files, of course, like if you were doing a database integration, you would use a blob binary large object. So not only can it be in a file path, but it can also be, binary code in a specific field, a blob that Bartender can then read. Okay, so just wanted to show you a couple. So all I did was just drag these here. So that is the relation to the backend system. And here's another document that I created, because I'm going to print both. I made them drastically different orientation, different colors, so that you can actually see that both are printing from an integration. So, all right, so then let me go into the integration file and show you some of the settings that you would set to facilitate integration with a backend source system. So this is a web service integration. So I mentioned that if you choose web service, it's going to expose a URL path. So right now it says host. I mean, if you were a company, it would be within your domain space. So it could be, xyzcompany.com/integrations, so on and so forth. You'd specify a port. And really that is it. If your end objective is to print fields that are being passed from a source system to one or many labels, all that source system has to do is send that message, that formatted HTTP message with the transactional data in the body of that message, to this URL. Bartender will treat all of that data as variable data. And here you see this % event data %. And all that means is everything I accept, everything that resides underneath the metadata, so the field names, which would be transactional. So if it was company, it would be, bartender, might be the company under there. It would pass the value in that metadata to the appropriate field on the label. So this is it. I mean, this is an integration that could facilitate integration and printing of all of your labels from multiple backend systems. So let me go ahead and show you how this would kind of work. So I'm going to go in and test mode, start this integration. And if you look down here under messages, as integrations execute, you will see a running list of messages that will give you a high level of granular detail related all of the activities that have transpired during the processing of this inbound message. So I don't have an active SAP, I don't have an active Oracle system that I can pull from, but every large ERP system or WMS system has transactions or functionality to be able to process outbound web service messages. Oracle has its Fusion middleware. It has its SOA suite, service-oriented architecture suite, where you can easily select which data you want to pass from Oracle to one or many third-party systems, target system, one of which would be Bartender. SAP has a dedicated middleware system for the purposes of communicating with other systems, SAP PI, Process Integrator. It has functionality embedded in SAP as well as part of NetWeaver. You can go into the SOA manager within the enterprise service repository for you SAP people. So that part should be taken care of internally, specific to that system, but the web service message will be fairly consistent among all of those external systems to Bartender. So as I said, I don't have an instance of an ERP system, but any developers on the line, you'll be aware that there's a myriad of testing tools that you can use to simulate web services. So let's pretend this is SAP SOA Builder, or let's pretend that this is Oracle Fusion middleware, and we're sending an outbound web service request to the Bartender integration builder, and for the purposes of printing a series of labels. So XML, HTTP message, URL to send this message to. In the body of the message, you have a series of XML commands. And then here you have the field names that you want to pass from your source system. And here you have the transactional data. So if you recall, I just did a data dump from the Kuner table, from the VBAC table into Bartender. And there were more than, what do I have here? I have 4 fields. So for this particular label, I'm sending 4 fields. Now what Bartender will do, because within those labels we have 20 I think it was, something like that, or it could be 100, it could be hundreds. What Bartender will do is, regardless of what fields you pass, it will ignore fields that are not passed. So you don't have to map one-to-one from your source system to Bartender, because Bartender will disregard those fields that are not being passed. So again, for ease of use, you can select from, say, 100 fields within the Bartender document. Those 100 fields can be in available to you in, say, 5, 10 different label documents. And each of those label documents will have a separate set of fields that need to be populated from your backend system, even though you can select from the complete list. So when I'm talking about downloading your file structure, downloading your tables, you only have to do that activity once. And then Bartender will only consume the values for the fields that are being passed to it at runtime. So here I'm only passing 4 fields. These are the values. I'm printing 2 separate records to this document. And then in this same message, I'm printing a completely different document, that second document, with 4 completely different fields, with 2 records included in those fields. So 2 labels will print here. One other thing of note, you'll notice that there are 4 fields that I'm passing from my source system to my target system. In record 1, all of those fields are populated. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the second record, only 3 fields are populated. So as I mentioned, Bartender will ignore that 4th because it's not being passed from this source system, even though that field exists and is available on the label. So let me go ahead and show you how this works. So as I showed you before, we really just specified everything as being event data. So very minimal amount of configuration there. I'm passing the data from a web service, from a source system, this Postman testing tool. I'm printing 2 labels with these fields on it, which are included on label 1. I'm printing these 2 records to this other label with these completely separate set of 4 fields. So let me go ahead and send that. So right now I'm just sending the request to this this URL that is exposed by Bartender. And here you'll see that in Bartender I have a response message. So not only did Bartender accept the data that resided in this web service message, it processed it and it passed a response message back to the source, to the source system. So here, so this is a response from Bartender back to this testing tool. And as I mentioned before, here's a series of messages. Oh, look what I did. The picture object might be clipped. That's too bad, but anyways, so if you dive into any of these messages, you can see a level of granularity with regards to what was received and where it was passed. So you can actually see the transformation of data as it's processed from the source to the target in each of these messages. So let me actually show you the labels. So 2 labels printed, you see, say Bartender completed successfully. So I printed 2 records to document 1, and here they are. This is my dog. So as you noted in one of the fields, it was referencing a picture location, a file path for a specific picture. This was that picture. And then the second one did not reference that picture. So this is one web service, one document with different fields being populated. And then it also printed that second document because in the web service message, you know, I printed these 2 records to this document, these 2 records to this document. So you just saw the results of of those two labels. Now let's look at the other label. So here's a list of fields, dream car, label 1, label 2, that we did not reference a picture file in that second record. So that's not there. So, and that's basically it. So think of any fields in your backend system that you need to transmit transactional data to Bartender for the purposes of label print. If you reference the fields as is, so KNA1 Kuhner in SAP equals Kuhner field on the label, it treats it as event data, you're done. Now you're not locked into that, so I forgot to mention that. So if for some reason the fields on your label document were different than your source systems, just a little bit more work, but all you would do is specify what the source system name is and what the target field name is. So KNA Kuhner in SAP, Kuhner is what it's called in SAP. Customer number is what you want to call it on the label. All you have to do is just map those fields. But easiest possible method from an enterprise perspective, since you're typically dealing with a large number of fields that are relevant for label print, is just to leave the names the same. But that's completely up to who's ever implementing it. Okay, so I think that's all I have. I can pass it back to you for questions, Elizabeth.
Stacy?
Yeah, I'll take on over some questions. Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. Really do appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. So yeah, we had quite a few questions come in, but if you still want to submit one, please go ahead at this time. If we don't have time right now to get to your question, no worries. We'll follow up with you via email. Awesome. So a question we have here is, what is the typical level of effort to integrate a system like Oracle ERP or WMS with Bartender? Would I need to hire a consultant to set Bartender up and manage the integration?
Well, of course, that depends on the level of complexity, but I will say most of our enterprise customers are very capable and able to configure integrations in Bartender themselves, even without technical resources. Because when it comes down to it, Bartender just needs the data. That is to populate one or many different labels. And Bartender's integration architecture kind of facilitates that. So its architecture is set up to deploy that system service that I mentioned, that is basically waiting for that trigger event to happen. And then the trigger event can facilitate the integration between not only one, so it would be Oracle ERP, it could be Oracle WMS, it can be SAP, it can be Microsoft Dynamics. All of those backend systems can trigger label print requests in best case scenario through one integration. So that's where it kind of leads back to the questions up front with regards to pre-built connectors. Bartender will accept data from multiple backend system that is agnostic of any one specific system, and that's actually a major selling point of Bartender. So as long as Bartender receives the data, regardless of from what backend system, Bartender can process it, and in a fairly straightforward manner. I mean, I think I showed just now, I created a couple of labels. All I did was drag file names over there. Let's say, I illustrated a SAP table. If I wanted to also download a file structure from Oracle ERP, obviously the field names will be completely different. I could actually include those as part of the database fields available to me on that one particular label. All I would do is just import both of those database connections, and then I would do some sort of table join such that Bartender could easily differentiate between one source and another. But all that is just joining tables and adding additional fields to the database data source panel on the left, and then you just drag and relate to fields on the label. And then if you choose to have everything be variable within the integration, then as I showed you, if you just choose everything to be event data, and the name is the same between the source and the target, the label, it really doesn't matter where that data comes from, whether it's Oracle ERP or SAP or Microsoft Dynamics. Bartender will just take the data based on the field name and map it to the same field name that exists on the label template. So, I mean, I would say generally not, but as we know, there can be very complex processes in these types of deployments, Oracle ERP or WMS. But I hope I was able to illustrate that it at face value, it's really not very complicated. So, yeah.
Awesome. And so another question we have is, we're just starting SAP implementation at our company. How would Bartender fit into the implementation strategy that SAP recommends?
Well, I mean, SAP deployments tend to be very long in duration and have a full strategy behind them. So, it's a phased approach. You start out in project preparation, move on to business blueprint, realization, final prep, go live. So that's from a deployment perspective. And then from a more technical rollout, you'll have your gold client, you'll have your dev client, you have your QA, production, and then there's a whole process to migrate configuration from development and sandbox environment all the way to production for the purposes of go live. So let me address that in two regards, one being the label management process as well as the integration process. So for label management, which this is really more, I think, pertinent to that question, you can assign, in Bartender, you can assign states to labels. So think of a state, and states are completely configurable. So state would equal something like development state. And then that development state would move to a QA state, and that QA state, well, usually you go back to dev and then you go to prod, but all those states can be configured consistent with whatever implementation methodology you're deploying. So, this was SAP, so that's kind of how it goes, dev, QA, prod. So you can have those states be consistent with what SAP prescribes within their ASAP methodology, or you can create your own unique states that make sense for you and your rollout from a system client landscape perspective. The thing about label states is that they have workflow transitions built in, such that a label in dev state cannot move directly to, say, a prod state without first going through the QA state. So this is kind of consistent with the system landscape that SAP recommends. You can't configure something in dev and move it right into prod. You have to go through QA first, test it, and then have it approved, and then you can move it to prod once everything looks okay. So you can configure Bartender to mimic that type of transition. You can also build the approval workflows such that a manager would have to approve a label before moving to a prod state. So again, this is kind of consistent with how SAP prescribes it as well. But for the integrations, Bartender separates the build and test functionality from the deploy and manage. So that was the integration builder versus admin console slide that I showed a while back. The build and test of integrations can occur without affecting the production version of your integration. So once you fully test them, the integrations can be deployed into production. Also, integrations can be deployed and managed independently. So if you're bringing a new integration process online, you can either build it into your existing integration file or create a new one that can operate independently. So, this kind of just shows that you can separate your productive environment from your dev and QA environment, such that you don't have to bring your system down in order to make changes, or you don't So everyone can be operating in a productive environment. You can still go through your dev QA process and then either replace an existing integration without bringing your system down, or add an additional integration into your productive environment.
Awesome. And so we are getting close to time, and we just have one more question that we can answer with our last 3 minutes. But again, if you do have a question that you want to have answered, we'll get to it via email after the presentation. So still submit those questions with a little bit of time we have left. But for our last one, the question is, what data formats do I need to use when integrating my backend system with Bartender?
So when you build your integrations using Integration Builder, you can specify the data format, specifically. So if you're using XML, you can say, okay, the integration should expect XML. If you're using text, quote and comma delineated text, you can specify that it's text. Or if you're using JSON, you can specify that the incoming message is JSON. You can also transmit SOAP, and you can specify that there's going to be SOAP tags and attributes as well. But Bartender is fairly intelligent in that, and this is consistent with what I said before about being able to accept incoming data from multiple backend systems. Because one system you may be using JSON, the other system you may be using XML, another system you may be transmitting via text. You can set the data format in Bartender to be what we call unstructured. So if you plan to use one of the integrations with multiple third-party systems, it may actually be better to use unstructured. Because Bartender is intelligent enough to be able to parse out the data in any number of formats. It basically, figures out where the data relevant for label print resides within a message. So, for example, if you're sending a quote and comma delineated text file, it'll know that, hey, these quotes and commas probably aren't transactional data. So it'll parse those out for you. And then in another instance, it'll recognize certain JSON information and parse out the tag information around that, and only look for the transactional data relevant for that, for printing to that one or many labels. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. Really do appreciate it. And thank you so much to Elizabeth and to everyone else who joined us as well. Again, we'll be sending out slides and access to the recording, and follow up with any of y'all who submitted a question later on today. And we will have those subtitles or translations in about a week or so. So stay tuned for that as well. And thank you all so much. We hope you have a great rest of your day.